You know, there is something incredibly appealing about ancient Rome. Perhaps that is why Hollywood returns to this story again and again, shooting film after film about gladiators, emperors, and legions. And this is where the interesting part begins. Because the Rome we see on screen is not the Rome that actually existed. Let us imagine for a second. You turn on another historical blockbuster, and there are luxurious villas with swimming pools just like in Beverly Hills, legionaries in bright red tunics marching in perfect formation, gladiators with chiseled muscles fighting to the death at every turn. Spectacular? Absolutely. True? Well, that is more complicated. The fact is that cinema turned antiquity into a beautiful picture from the very beginning. Even in the 1950s, when the sword and sandal genre was flourishing, studios spared no budget on decorations. Silk tunics, sparkling armor, grandiose battle scenes with real elephants. All this was filmed, paradoxically, only a few kilometers from the real Roman ruins. American directors moved production to the Italian Cinecittà studios to save on labor. And it was there, at the foot of the ancient hills, that the colorful, lush, and in many ways fictional Rome that we still carry in our heads was born. But the real Roman Empire was completely different. It was based not on spectacle and luxury, but on something much simpler and simultaneously deeper, on strict laws and a moral code called mos maiorum, which means customs of the ancestors. This was a whole system of values that permeated the life of every Roman citizen. Honesty, thrift, sincerity, perseverance, loyalty to traditions. This is what was considered truly important. These customs were surrounded by an aura of sacredness because the Romans revered their ancestors and believed that it was their wisdom that led Rome to greatness. But something happened over these 2,000 years. Somewhere between the lines of ancient sources, in the translations of the 19th century, in the scripts of Hollywood blockbusters and television series of recent decades, the true image of Rome dissolved and myths grew in its place. Some were born from a misunderstanding of Latin words. Others, from hostile propaganda spread by ancient authors against unwanted emperors. Still others, simply because a spectacular fiction sells better than a modest truth. And today I want to analyze the 10 most persistent misconceptions about the Roman Empire with you. We will talk about the fact that the Romans did not actually build vomiting rooms during feasts, that gladiators survived more often than they died, that legionaries wore by no means only red tunics, and that Emperor Nero physically could not play the violin during the fire, simply because violins did not exist yet. Each of these stories will reveal a little more about the real Rome, complex, contradictory, but incredibly interesting. Make yourselves comfortable. We are embarking on a journey through the ages and myths. Myth 1. The vomitorium. So, the first misconception I want to start with is perhaps the most repulsive and simultaneously the most persistent. You have probably heard this story somewhere, that the ancient Romans were such gluttons that during their famous feasts, they would overeat to such an extent that they had to specially go out to a separate room to empty their stomach and return to the table for a new portion. And these rooms even had a special name, vomitoria, meaning literally vomiting rooms. Sounds creepy, right? And the main thing is that it fits so well into the image of a decadent, luxury-ridden Rome that films and books portray for us. Imagine the scene. Marble floors, tables laden with delicacies, wine flowing like a river, and somewhere in the corner of a rich villa, that very room of shame. But guess what? All this is pure fiction. Let us figure out where this strange legend came from in the first place. The fact is that vomitoria really existed, only not in houses, and not for the purposes that everyone thought. It was an architectural marvel, an engineering solution that the Romans devised for their grand amphitheaters and stadiums. Imagine the Colosseum, a huge structure that accommodated tens of thousands of spectators. 50 or even more than 50,000 people came there to see gladiatorial combat, wild beast hunts, and theatrical performances. And now the question, how to ensure that this entire crowd could quickly enter before the spectacle began and just as quickly leave the arena afterward without creating a terrible crush? Roman architects found a brilliant solution. They created a system of special passages and corridors that permeated the entire building, like arteries permeating a living organism. These passages led from the external entrances directly to the rows of seats on different levels of the amphitheater. Spectators entered through them, dispersed to their places, and after the performance, just as quickly were vomited back onto the city streets. That is precisely why these passages were named vomitoria, from the Latin verb vomere, which means to vomit or to spew forth. But what was being spewed forth was not the contents of feasting Roman stomachs, but streams of people pouring out of the amphitheater. A metaphor, you see. The same as when we say today that a river flows out into the sea or a volcano erupts lava. In the Colosseum alone, there were 80 such vomitoria. 80! Thanks to them, the huge crowd could leave the building literally in a matter of minutes. This was such a successful solution that it has survived to our day. If you have been to modern stadiums, you have probably noticed a similar system of entrances and exits. We still use the Roman invention, we just do not think about it. The ancient author Macrobius wrote about these architectural elements. In his texts, the word vomitorium is used precisely in the context of spectators massively leaving the amphitheater after the performance is ended. There is no hint of feasting or vomiting, just a technical description of how a public building is constructed. But here is what is interesting. The myth about vomiting rooms did not arise entirely out of nowhere. The Romans did indeed organize lavish feasts where the wealthy indulged in excesses. And yes, sometimes these feasts ended in unpleasant ways. Seneca the Younger, a Roman philosopher and one of the most insightful critics of the morals of his time, wrote about this rather sarcastically. They vomit so that they may eat, and eat so that they may vomit. Harsh words, I agree. But this was a criticism of the moral degradation of certain representatives of the Roman elite, and by no means a description of everyday practice or an architectural feature of homes. No special rooms were built for these purposes. That would have been an absurd waste of space and resources. The Romans were too practical for such follies. If someone felt ill after excessive consumption of wine or food, they simply left the triclinium, the dining room, and went outside to the courtyard or garden. A common occurrence that happens at feasts in all epochs and among all peoples. So, the next time someone mentions the vomiting rooms of the Romans to you, you can confidently correct your interlocutor. Vomitoria are a brilliant example of Roman engineering. The ability to organize space and people flow so that tens of thousands of people could comfortably enjoy spectacles. And they are certainly not evidence of unrestrained gluttony and moral decay, as is commonly believed. Myth 2. Gladiators always fought to the death. Now that we have dealt with the vomitoria, let us turn to those who actually entered the Colosseum arena, the gladiators. And here we again face a collision with Hollywood. If you believe the films, especially the famous Gladiator from the year 2000, every fight in the arena ended in only one way. Someone inevitably perished. The sand was soaked in blood, the crowd roared, demanding the death of the loser, and the victor delivered the final blow. Dramatic, epic, breathtaking. But this has a very distant relation to reality. Imagine that you are the owner of a gladiator school in the 1st century AD. You have several dozen fighters, each of whom trained for years. They were taught to handle different types of weapons, to move in a certain way, to understand fighting tactics. Training each gladiator cost tens of thousands of sesterces, huge amounts of money for those times. These were real investments, almost like buying an expensive sports car today. And now the question, why would you send these expensive, professionally trained fighters to certain death? Economically, that would be absolute madness. The Romans loved many things, but throwing money away unnecessarily was definitely not one of their habits. A Roman jurist named Gaius, who lived in the 2nd century, left us some very curious figures. If the organizer of the games rented a gladiator and returned him alive and healthy, he paid 20 denarii, which amounted to 80 sesterces. A decent sum, but quite manageable. And now, pay attention. If the gladiator died in the arena or received such injuries that he could no longer fight, the rental automatically turned into a sale, and the price soared to 1,000 denarii, 50 times more. Do you feel the difference? The organizer of the games would think 10 times before demanding a gladiator's death. It was simply too expensive. Modern historians, having studied the preserved inscriptions on gladiator gravestones, school records, and wall paintings, especially in Pompeii where time stopped during the eruption of Vesuvius, came to an astonishing conclusion. Only approximately 20% of the fights ended with the death of one of the participants. That is, only 1 out of 5 duels was fatal. And even this usually happened if the loser performed absolutely poorly or if the crowd insisted particularly strongly. The fact is that the purpose of gladiatorial games was not mass bloodshed at all. The Romans wanted spectacle, skill, drama. A good fight is like a good theatrical production: tension, mastery, an unpredictable finale. If every duel simply turned into a slaughter, it would quickly bore even the most bloodthirsty audience. Moreover, after the reforms carried out by the emperors Octavian Augustus and Tiberius, approximately after the 27th year before our era, real rules appeared in the arenas. Now a gladiator could surrender at any moment. For this, he had to lower his shield and raise his index finger. A special person called the summa rudis, the referee or judge, was present in the arena. He monitored compliance with the rules and could stop the fight if he saw that one of the fighters was on the verge of death. And guess what else? A doctor was often allowed into the arena. His task was to assess the condition of the injured gladiator and, if necessary, quickly treat the wounds. Because an injured but living fighter is a fighter who can perform again, and a deceased one is lost investment. For many people, the path of a gladiator was not a sentence, but an opportunity. Yes, among them were slaves and prisoners of war. But as mortality in the arenas decreased, more and more free men voluntarily signed up for gladiator schools. Why? Because a successful gladiator could earn decent money, gain fame, and after dozens of victories, even freedom. By the way, one of these schools should be mentioned separately: the famous amphitheater in Capua. It was there that the most famous gladiator in history, Spartacus, once trained. The one who raised a revolt and kept the entire Roman Empire in suspense for several years. A story worthy of a separate telling. Of course, I do not want to say that the arena was a safe place. People did indeed die there, especially in later times, in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, when Roman society became harsher and more bloodthirsty. The mortality rate among gladiators sharply increased. Now every second loser died. But this was a departure from tradition, a degradation of the system, not its original essence. The true gladiatorial fights during the empire's peak were a complex art, where not only strength and cruelty were valued, but also skill, tactics, and the ability to read the opponent. It was a sport, albeit a dangerous one. The Romans created a whole industry around it, with rules, economy, and arena stars. So the next time you see a scene from a movie where gladiators fight to the death under the roar of the crowd, remember, the reality was much more complex and interesting. The Romans were practical people, and even in their cruel entertainment, they knew how to find a balance between spectacle and common sense. Myth 3. Gladiators were bodybuilders. So, we already know that gladiators survived much more often than they died in the arena. But now, let us talk about what they looked like. And here we have another surprise. Close your eyes and imagine a typical gladiator from a movie. What do you see? Probably a tanned man with perfectly sculpted abs, bulging biceps, broad shoulders, and minimal body fat percentage. A walking dream of a fitness trainer. Russell Crowe in Gladiator from the year 2000, all those actors in 1950s peplum films, all look like bodybuilders. But here is the surprising thing. Real Roman gladiators looked completely different. And the evidence of this lay in the earth for nearly 2,000 years, patiently waiting for archaeologists to uncover it. In the 1993 year, in the Turkish city of Ephesus, once the richest capital of the Roman province of Asia, scholars stumbled upon an unusual cemetery. More than 60 graves and all. young men with characteristic injuries on their bones, fractures, traces of weapon blows, healed wounds. There was no doubt. The researchers had found an ancient gladiator cemetery. Specialists from the Vienna Medical University conducted a very curious study. They used isotopic analysis of the bones, a modern technology that allows determining exactly what a person ate during life. And this is where the most interesting part began. It turned out that the gladiator diet was predominantly vegetarian. Yes, you heard that right. These professional fighters, who were supposed to be in excellent physical shape, ate something completely different from what we expected. Their diet was very high in carbohydrates and very low in protein. They consumed much more vegetables, legumes, and grains, and much less meat than ordinary city dwellers. But the funniest thing is that the Romans did not hide this. Pliny the Elder, the famous encyclopedist of the 1st century, directly called gladiators hordearii, barley eaters. Not a particularly flattering nickname, if you think about it. Imagine if modern athletes were called oatmeal eaters, a similar shade of irony. And we also have the testimony of a man who knew gladiators firsthand, a doctor named Galen. Somewhere between the 159th and 161st years of our era, he worked at a medical school for gladiators in the city of Pergamum. That is, he did not just observe them from the sidelines. He treated their wounds, monitored their health, and saw them every day. And here is what Galen says about their diet. The basis of the diet was barley porridge, lots of barley porridge. They also ate thick soups made from legumes, lentils, peas, beans, bean puree mixed with barley, dried fruits for variety, wheat bread in large quantities. All this provided energy, of course, but this diet was poorly suited for building those Hollywood muscles. However, it was perfectly suited for another goal. The fact is that this diet promoted the accumulation of fat deposits. And this was not accidental, but a fully conscious strategy. A layer of subcutaneous fat served as natural armor. It protected ligaments, nerves, and blood vessels from deep cuts. Think about it. A gladiator with chiseled abs gets struck by a sword, and the blade easily reaches vital organs. And a gladiator with a decent layer of fat? The same blow produces an impressive, spectacular cut. Blood flows. The audience is thrilled. But the wound turns out to be superficial. The fighter survives and can fight again. Remember, we talked about how a gladiator's death was economically unprofitable. Here is another way the Romans extended the lives of their fighters. Moreover, there is one very curious testimony from Cicero himself. In his 3rd Philippic, which is an angry speech against Mark Antony, the great orator compares the physique of his political enemy to the body of a gladiator. And this is clearly not a compliment. Cicero hints at massiveness, at heaviness. If gladiators were slender athletes with six-packs, such a comparison simply would not have made sense. Of course, this does not mean that gladiators were clumsy, fat men. They underwent brutal training, moved a lot, and wielded weapons expertly. It is just that their bodies were adapted to the tasks they faced. They had to survive, impress the public with spectacular but non-fatal injuries, and serve their masters for as long as possible. So the image of the gladiator is not a comic book superhero with ideal proportions. It is more likely a sturdy, stocky man with developed musculature, but definitely with a noticeable layer of fat. To be completely honest, they probably resembled modern sumo wrestlers, or weightlifters more. Strong, powerful, but certainly not lean. And you know, there is a logic to this. The Romans were practical people. They did not pursue a beautiful image for the sake of the image. They created a system that worked, economically advantageous, spectacular, and maximally extending the career of expensive fighters. And the fact that this system does not correspond to our modern ideas about an athletic body, well, that is our problem, not theirs. Myth 4. Everyone wore togas every day. So, we have already debunked several myths about gladiators. Now, let us step outside the arena and look at ordinary Romans strolling through the streets of their city. And again, we are met by the familiar Hollywood image. Close your eyes and imagine a typical scene from a movie about ancient Rome. What do you see? Probably streets filled with people in snow-white togas, elegantly draped around their bodies. Senators in togas, ordinary citizens in togas, all wrapped up in these majestic garments. White togas everywhere, as if you have stumbled into some endless ancient graduation ceremony. The poet Virgil even called the Romans the people dressed in togas. Sounds beautiful, right? The reality, however, as always, turns out to be slightly more complicated and much more practical. The fact is that the toga was indeed the most important symbol of Roman citizenship. It was not just an item of clothing, it was a sign that you belonged to the chosen few, that you were a full citizen of the greatest empire in the world. Only Roman citizens had the right to wear the wool toga. If a person was exiled from the city, they lost this right along with all other privileges. Foreigners were strictly forbidden from wearing the toga. Even if they lived in Rome for decades, even if they were rich and respected, the toga remained inaccessible to them. But here is what is interesting. The very fact that the toga was such an important symbol did not mean that the Romans wore it every day. Quite the opposite. Imagine that a toga is a huge piece of wool fabric. At its widest part, it reached 2 meters in width and in length could be from 3 to 10 meters, depending on the type and status of the owner. This is not a shirt that you can quickly pull on in the morning. It is a whole work of art that had to be draped correctly. And this is where the fun begins. Draping a toga independently was practically impossible. It required a trained slave, and sometimes even several. Rich households kept special slaves called vestipliciarii, literally cloth folders. Their sole duty was to clothe the masters in togas, creating beautiful, correct folds on the chest and ensuring the right shoulder remained uncovered. These folds were even fixed with special clamps when the toga was stored, making it easier to put on next time. Now imagine that every morning you have to call a servant, stand motionless for about 20 minutes while you are wrapped in meters of heavy woolen fabric, and then walk around all day in this bulky garment that restricts movement, is hot in the summer, and constantly threatens to slip if you make too sudden a move. A questionable pleasure, you would agree. The Romans, as we have seen repeatedly, were a practical people, and very quickly they found a way around this inconvenience. Already in the times of the late Republic, and then during the period of the Empire, the toga began to transform from everyday clothing into ceremonial attire. The poet Martial, who lived approximately from the 40th to the 104th year of our era, left us eloquent testimony. He wrote that in small Italian towns, the toga was worn only 1 or 2 times a month, when the family celebrated some solemn event or holiday in honor of the household gods. 1 or 2 times a month. And all the rest of the time, people wore something much more comfortable. Even in Rome itself, where traditions were strictly observed and on the periphery, citizens increasingly preferred ordinary cloaks instead of togas. Emperor Octavian Augustus, who was very zealous about old customs, even ordered special officials, the aediles, to ensure that every Roman citizen on the forum and in the circus wore a toga. But even these strict measures did not help. The tradition was slowly dying. In the end, the toga began to be worn only where it was absolutely necessary. At public games, in court, during sacrifices, when clients came in the morning to greet their patron. On major holidays, of course. But on an ordinary day? No, thank you. And what did the Romans wear in everyday life? It is very simple. Tunics. These were simple shirts made of wool or linen, usually hip length or knee length. Very similar to a long t-shirt, to be honest. Comfortable, practical, you could work, walk, run. In cool weather, cloaks of various styles were thrown over the tunic. Sagum, lacerna, paenula, but not a toga. Women, by the way, also did not constantly walk around in complicated draperies. They wore stolas, a type of tunic, only longer and wider, down to the feet. They might throw a palla over it, something like a large scarf or shawl, elegant, comfortable, and does not require the help of 3 slaves to dress. Do you see the point? The toga was a symbol, ceremonial attire, a sign of status, much like a business suit and tie today. It is worn for important meetings, presentations, official events. But no one wears a three-piece suit to the beach or when going to the store for bread. The same went for the Romans. Practicality and comfort were more important to them than ceremonialism in everyday life. They created a beautiful tradition, surrounded it with honor and respect, but they did not forget common sense. Why suffer every day when you can put on a light tunic and calmly go about your business? So if you suddenly find yourself on the streets of ancient Rome on an ordinary weekday, do not be surprised. You will see many more people in simple tunics than in majestic togas. The snow-white draperies will remain for special occasions, for the Senate, for the temples, and life, real everyday life, flows in much humbler clothes. Myth 5. All legionaries wore red. We have discussed the everyday clothing of ordinary Romans, ceremonial togas. Now it is time to talk about those who defended the empire, the legionaries. And again, we face the classic Hollywood image. Turn on any movie about Rome, and you will see them. Strict rows of soldiers in identical armor and, of course, in bright red tunics. A sea of red color, swaying in the wind like a huge banner of war. Gladiator, the eagle of the 9th Legion, countless historical reenactments and computer games, everywhere the same picture. The Roman legion is necessarily a red legion. And you know, there is a certain logic to this. Red color indeed had special significance for the Romans. It was the color of Mars, the god of war, whom they revered as the mythological father of Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of the Eternal City. Red symbolized blood, strength, belligerence. The Romans considered themselves a people chosen by the god of war, and the red color was supposed to remind both friends and foes of this. It is easy to imagine the psychological impact thousands of warriors in scarlet tunics, marching in uniform formation, would have on some motley barbarian army. It would be impressive, I agree. But reality, as usual, turns out to be much more mundane and interesting. The fact is that we do not have a single credible proof that all Roman legionaries wore exclusively red tunics. Moreover, everything points to the opposite. Let us return to how the Roman army was structured in the first centuries of our era. This was not conscription with mandatory state uniform, as in modern armies. When a person entered military service, he took care of his own wardrobe. Yes, indeed, himself. Soldiers received pay, not very large, I must say, and had to purchase clothing with that money. Often, legionaries received packages from their families. Imagine, somewhere in a distant village, the soldier's mother or wife weaves him a new tunic from available wool, dyes it with available dyes, and sends it to the empire's border. She thinks about warmth and practicality, not about ensuring her son or husband looks exactly like thousands of other soldiers. And the most surprising thing, there were no edicts from above regarding the mandatory color of tunics. There was no requirement for uniformity of clothing. Moreover, even the soldiers' weapons and armor differed. Everyone wore what they could afford. Some had good chainmail inherited from their father, others had a simple leather cuirass with metal overlays. And it was the same story with tunics. Now add the geography. The Roman Empire stretched from foggy Britain to the scorching sands of Egypt, from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the banks of the Euphrates. Each region had its own natural dyes available. What was cheap and easily accessible in one province could cost a fortune in another. In Egypt, for example, it was easy to obtain certain shades of red. The necessary plants grew there, from which the dye was extracted. And in Britain, there is a completely different climate, different vegetation, and completely different opportunities for dyeing fabrics. A legionary serving on Hadrian's Wall in a cold northern province wore what relatives from nearby lands could send him, and the color of that tunic could be anything. Researchers who studied preserved sources, both written testimonies, archaeological finds, and images on frescoes, concluded that Roman legionaries wore tunics of various colors. White, perhaps even most often because undyed wool was the cheapest. Gray, brown, black. Various shades of red, of course, were also found, from pale pink to dark brown. The poet Martial, who lived in the 1st century of our era, left us a curious line. Rome wears darker fabric, and Gaul wears red. Boys love this color, and so do the military. Note that he is talking specifically about dark red, practically brown color. Not scarlet, not purple, but a dark, muted shade. And this made sense. A legionary on campaign, in the camp, on duty. He was constantly getting dirty. His tunic tore, it was washed dozens of times. Bright colors quickly faded in the sun and dulled after numerous washings. As a result, gray-brown, earthy shades predominated, practical and non-staining. True, there were special cases when the army still cared about the soldier's appearance. During solemn ceremonies, triumphal processions, and important religious holidays, legionaries were issued specially prepared snow-white tunics. White symbolized purity, the solemnity of the moment. But this was perhaps the only case of any uniformity. There is one very curious piece of evidence, a fresco from Pompeii. Remember, this city was preserved in the ash of the eruption of Vesuvius, saving many details of Roman life for us. Well, one of the frescoes depicts 3 legionaries standing side by side. And what? 2 of them are dressed in white tunics, and the third in red. Here is living proof that even in the same unit, at the same time, soldiers could wear clothes of different colors. Officers were a different matter. They really tried to stand out. Centurions often wore tunics of bright red, almost scarlet color, expensive, dyed with quality dyes. Commanders' cloaks, paludamentum, were also bright red. This was necessary. The commander had to be visible in battle so that soldiers always knew where he was and where to go, and only generals of the highest rank could afford the most expensive purple tunics. And here is something else interesting: the Roman fleet. Sailors and rowers serving on military ships wore blue tunics. The military theorist Vegetius wrote about this in the 4th century of our era. Blue was a tribute to the marine element, perhaps a connection with Neptune, the god of the seas. There was indeed some standardization here, but this only concerned the fleet, not the land legions. So the real picture turns out to be much more colorful than in the movies. A Roman legion on the march is not a sea of uniform red color. It is rather a mix of white, gray, brown, and dark brown tunics with rare splashes of red. Somewhere, the bright scarlet cloaks of centurions stand out. Somewhere, a snow-white ceremonial tunic flashes. A motley, practical, real army of real people, not a parade picture for the cinema. And in this, it seems to me, there is a certain beauty. The Romans did not pursue external effect at the expense of practicality. They built an army that was meant to fight, not to impress on a movie set. Each soldier wore what was available, comfortable, and corresponded to his means. And this army conquered half the world not because it looked beautiful, but because it knew how to fight. Myth 6. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. We talked about the legionaries defending the empire on its borders. But let us now return to Rome itself, to its very heart, and talk about one of the most famous events in the history of the Eternal City, the Great Fire of the 64th year of our era, and of course about Emperor Nero. Oh, this Nero! How much has been written about him? How many legends? How much black ink has been spilled by historians? If popular culture is to be believed, he was a real monster, a mad tyrant who set fire to his own capital and then stood on a palace tower and played the violin, enjoying the sight of the burning city. A beautiful, creepy picture, a symbol of the absolute indifference of power to the suffering of the people, an image that has firmly entered mass culture and become proverbial. When they want to say that someone is inactive during a catastrophe, they say he is like Nero, playing the violin while everything burns. However, there is one small problem with this story. No, even 2 problems, and both are quite substantial. Problem 1. Violins did not exist in the 1st century of our era. Not at all. They were invented only 1,000 or even 1,500 years after Nero's death. The violin in its modern form appeared somewhere in the 16th century. That is, Nero physically could not play the violin simply because the instrument did not yet exist in the world. If the emperor did play music, and he was indeed a passionate musician, even participating in music competitions, which terribly annoyed conservative senators, he played the lyre, kithara. This is an ancient stringed instrument somewhat similar to a harp or lyre. 7 strings, a beautiful resonating body, but it definitely was not a violin. And now, problem 2, even more serious. When the fire broke out in Rome on the night of the 18th to the 19th of July of the 64th year of our era, Nero was not in the city at all. He was relaxing at his villa in Antium, about 50 kilometers from the capital on the coast. The heat was terrible, and the emperor had quite reasonably retreated from the scorching city to the sea. You would agree that for a person who allegedly intentionally arranged a grand arson to enjoy the spectacle, Nero is behaving somewhat illogically. Why leave the city right before the main event? Meanwhile, the fire was truly terrifying. It started in the shops near the Circus Maximus and rapidly spread through the narrow, crooked streets of ancient Rome. The fire raged for 6 days and 7 nights. 4 districts out of 14 burned to the ground, and another 7 were seriously damaged. Half the city was left homeless, and that is hundreds of thousands of people. Ancient temples burned down, along with the homes of noble families decorated with trophies from conquered lands and priceless relics from the time of the kings. When Nero was informed of the catastrophe, he immediately returned to the capital. And this is where the most interesting part begins, because his actions are completely unlike the behavior of a mad arsonist or an indifferent tyrant. Nero personally led the fight against the fire. This was testified by the historian Tacitus, the same Publius Cornelius Tacitus who himself survived the fire as a child and perfectly remembered the events. The emperor organized the evacuation of the population, opening his own palaces and gardens for the fire victims. People were accommodated in the imperial gardens, supplied with water and food. Nero ordered grain to be brought into the city and sold it at reduced prices to prevent hunger and speculation. Witnesses reported that the emperor looked stunned in those days, and the common people of Rome, note that it was the common people, not the elite, welcomed Nero, appreciating his help. Among ordinary Romans, rumors about the emperor's guilt somehow did not take hold. After the fire subsided, Nero developed a progressive plan for the city's restoration. He offered landowners financial assistance to clear the rubble. He introduced new building regulations. Now, houses had to be built of stone, not wood. Streets had to be straight and wide, not narrow and crooked, as before. A minimum distance was established between buildings. The main exits from houses now faced the street, not the courtyards. The city had to have a reliable water supply. Essentially, Nero acted as a responsible and humane ruler. He did everything he could in an incredibly difficult situation. But where did the legend of the violin and indifference come from then? And here we encounter the power of hostile propaganda. Most of what we know about Nero was written by his worst enemies. Senators hated the young emperor for his love of art, for participating in theatrical performances, all of which were considered unworthy of a ruler of Rome. They dreamed of returning to the old days of the Republic, constantly plotting conspiracies. And when their conspiracies were exposed and the emperor reacted hostilely, they became indignant and wrote angry texts. Suetonius Tranquillus, one of Nero's main accusers, wrote that the emperor intentionally set the city on fire and watched the flames from the Tower of Maecenas, dressed in a theatrical costume, and sang a poem about the fall of Troy. A colorful picture, yes. However, Suetonius wrote this decades after the events, based on rumors and testimonies from people hostile to Nero. Perhaps, and this is an interesting version, the emperor really did play music in those days. He was exhausted from fighting the fire, shocked by the scale of the catastrophe. And as a man of art, he might have comforted himself with music, drawing parallels between the fall of Troy and the fire in Rome. After all, the Romans believed they were descended from the Trojan Aeneas. It was a metaphor, a way to cope with stress. But somewhere in the retellings, in the unfriendly texts, this detail turned into an accusation. He played music became he indifferently played music while the city burned. And then, centuries later, the lyre or kithara turned into a violin, simply because the violin was a more understandable and familiar instrument to people of the New Age. And thus, the myth was born. A myth that turned out to be incredibly persistent because it has everything needed for a good story. A vivid villain, a dramatic disaster, a symbol of the indifference of power. It does not matter that it does not correspond to the facts. It does not matter that contemporaries of the events told a completely different story. The beautiful legend defeated the boring truth. And today, nearly 2,000 years later, we are still repeating this story. And the real Nero, a complex, contradictory man who tried to help his people at the moment of the greatest catastrophe of his reign, remains somewhere off-screen, obscured by the figure of a fictional monster with a violin. I'm Myth 7. Roman women were powerless recluses. We have debunked several myths about the men of Rome, about gladiators, legionaries, emperors. Now it is time to talk about the women. And again, we encounter a persistent stereotype that wanders from textbook to textbook, from film to film. The perception is simple and sad. A Roman woman is practically a recluse. She stays at home, manages the household, raises children, submissively obeys first her father, then her husband. No rights, no influence, no voice in public life. Practically a shadow, existing somewhere on the periphery of the great history created exclusively by men. And you know, there is some truth to this. Roman society was indeed patriarchal. That cannot be argued. Men held all official positions, sat in the Senate, commanded legions, and spoke in courts. Women formally had no political rights, did not vote, and could not be elected to state posts. Under Roman law, they were considered perpetual dependents. First under the power of the father, patria potestas, then under the power of the husband or guardian. But here is what is interesting. There is always a gap between formal law and real life. And in the case of Roman women, this gap was quite significant. Let us start with the most obvious, money and property, because it is the archaeological finds of recent decades that have completely overturned our ideas about the role of women in the Roman economy. Take, for example, Julia Felix, a woman from Pompeii. She owned a huge complex of real estate in this wealthy port city. Not just a house for herself and her family, a whole block with baths, shops, and premises rented out. This was a real business that brought serious income, and a woman managed all this. But perhaps Julia Felix is an exception, a wealthy widow who inherited her husband's fortune, right? Let us dig deeper. In Pompeii, Herculaneum, and other places, archaeologists found wooden tablets, tabulae. These were ancient documents of sorts, on which financial transactions, contracts, and receipts were recorded in wax. Among the finds is the so-called Archive of the Sulpicii, a whole collection of business documents from one banking family. Scholars analyzed 127 such tablets, and what was discovered? 23 documents, almost every fifth one, mention women as participants in financial operations, and not just as witnesses or decorations, but as full participants in the transactions. And the most curious thing, among these women were people of completely different statuses. Female slaves, serva, freedwomen, liberta, freeborn housewives, domina. Women from different strata of society engaged in business, took and gave loans, bought and sold goods. For example, Patulcia Herodes, judging by the name, a former slave who gained freedom. She bought something at auction for 19,500 sesterces. To give you an idea of the scale, with this amount you could buy approximately 40 tons of grain. This was not a small household purchase. It was a serious commercial operation. Or Marcia Fausta, who took out a loan of 2,000 sesterces. The freeborn Satia Priscilla owed someone 24,000 sesterces, a huge sum for those times. All these women conducted business, managed money, and participated in the economic life of the empire. Archaeologists found stamps with female names on bricks and ceramics, a sign that these women owned workshops and manufacturing facilities. Domitia Lepida ran a textile business. Another Roman woman, whose name is preserved on lead pipes, owned something like an ancient metal rolling mill. She supplied pipes for sewage and water supply systems. But what about the law? After all, we said that women were under the guardianship of men? Here begins the most interesting part. Indeed, Roman law stipulated that a woman was either under the power of her father, patria potestas, or under the power of her husband, manus. But here is what happened. From approximately the 2nd century before our era until the 2nd century of our era, a new form of marriage began to predominate in Roman society. Sine manu, that is, marriage without the husband's power over the wife. In such a marriage, the spouse's property remained separate. The woman continued to own what she brought into the marriage, or what she inherited from her father, and the husband had no right to dispose of her property without her consent. This gave women real economic independence. After the death of her father, many women formally passed under the guardianship of a special guardian, tutor. But in practice, this guardianship gradually turned into a formality. The woman could choose the guardian herself, and often it was one of her trusted people who simply signed where required. And then Emperor Octavian Augustus introduced a completely revolutionary law. A woman who had given birth to 3 children, if she was freeborn, or 4 children, if she was a freed woman, was completely exempted from the obligation to have a guardian. This was called ius trium liberorum, the right of 3 children. Such a woman became legally independent for life. Do you understand what this meant? A woman who fulfilled the most important function for the state, giving birth to and raising children, future citizens of the empire, gained almost complete legal independence. She could enter into contracts, dispose of property, and conduct business without anyone's permission. And it worked. Roman women opened shops, owned land plots, rented out premises, and lent money at interest. Many engaged in charity, financing the construction of public buildings, temples, and roads. Their names were carved on commemorative plaques as benefactresses of the city. And what about politics? Here it is more complicated, but also more interesting. Formally, women could not hold state positions. But women from high society, the wives and mothers of influential men, had enormous informal influence. Livia, the wife of Octavian Augustus, was practically one of the emperor's main advisors. Agrippina the Younger, Nero's mother, managed the empire equally with her son in the early years of his reign. Plotina, Trajan's wife, influenced the choice of the heir to the throne. These women did not sit in the Senate, but their opinions determined the fate of the state. There were even cases when Roman women appeared in court to defend their interests. True, this was later banned by a special decree. Women had mastered the art of judicial rhetoric too successfully. But even after the ban, they continued to dictate the strategy of legal proceedings to their lawyers. Of course, we should not idealize the situation. Roman society remained patriarchal, and most women spent their lives in domestic worries. But the image of the absolutely powerless recluse, which is often drawn for us, is a caricature, not reality. Roman women were much freer and more influential than, for example, women in neighboring Greece, where seclusion was indeed the norm. They went to theaters, to gladiatorial games, to baths. They managed the household, and a Roman house with dozens of slaves was an entire enterprise. They engaged in business, influenced politics through their husbands and sons, and left their mark on history. And most importantly, their position was changing for the better. From the early Republic to the late Empire, women's rights expanded and opportunities grew. Roman society was slowly but surely moving towards greater equality. So, the next time you see a silent Roman matron in a film, modestly sitting in the corner while men decide important matters, remember Julia Felix with her real estate empire. Remember Petulchia Eratus with her 40 tons of grain. Remember all those Roman women whose names are preserved on business tablets, stamps, and memorial plaques. They were there, in the thick of things. It is just that history, written by men, did not always notice their presence. Myth 8. Rome was a city of villas. We talked about women who conducted business and managed property. Now, let us talk about the property itself, where the Romans actually lived. When we think of a Roman dwelling, the same image usually comes to mind: a luxurious villa with columns, an inner courtyard, an atrium, where water splashes in a pool in the middle of a marble floor, mosaics on the floor, frescoes on the walls, statues in niches, quiet, spacious, beautiful. Or, if speaking of more modest residents, a small one-story house on the outskirts, somewhere in the countryside. Films and television series reinforce this notion. The rich live in villas, the poor in huts. Everything is horizontal, everything is low-rise. The ancient city seems to us like a modern suburb. Lots of greenery, lots of space, rare buildings. But here is the surprising thing. If you were transported to Rome in the 1st or 2nd century of our era and walked its streets, you would be amazed not by the horizontal layout, but by the vertical. Because towering above you would be houses of 5, 6, 7, and sometimes all 8 stories. Real skyscrapers by the standards of that era. Meet the insula, the Roman version of a modern apartment building. The name comes from the Latin word island, perhaps because these massive buildings stood like islands among the narrow streets, or perhaps because each such building occupied an entire city block. The history of the insula began approximately in the 4th century before our era. Rome grew rapidly, the population increased, and the city's territory was limited by the old Servian walls. Land inside became less and less, and people more and more. And the Romans found a simple but brilliant solution. If you cannot grow wide, you must grow tall. At first, these were modest structures. A row of shops on the 1st floor, living quarters on the 2nd. Then a 3rd floor appeared. By the 3rd century before our era, most insulae already had 3 stories, and then began a real race to the sky. There is even a funny testimony from the historian Livy. He recounts how in the 218th year before our era, on the eve of the Second Punic War, a bull escaped from the cattle market and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor of a house. The Romans considered this a bad omen. But for us, something else is important. Even then, there were stairs in the city leading to the 3rd floor of residential buildings, and the great Cicero wrote figuratively and accurately in the 63rd year before our era. Rome has risen upwards and hangs in the air. The city was indeed growing upwards. But there was one problem. Insulae were built quickly, cheaply, and frankly, quite carelessly. Developers and the entrepreneurial Romans quickly realized how to make money renting out housing, cut corners on everything. On the quality of the concrete, on the depth of the foundations, on the strength of the floors. Internal partitions in cheap insulae were sometimes made of woven branches covered with plaster. The architect Vitruvius wrote about this with clear disapproval. It would be better if they had not been invented. They save space and time, but in a fire they are ready torches. And he was absolutely right. Insulae often collapsed. Fire spread through them with incredible speed. Remember the Great Fire under Nero that we discussed? It was the dense construction of cheap wooden insulae that helped the fire spread so quickly through the city. The authorities tried to control the situation. Emperor Octavian Augustus introduced a restriction. Insulae could not be higher than 70 Roman feet, which was approximately 20 meters. After that very fire, Nero tightened the rules even further, lowering the maximum height to 60 feet, about 18 meters. But here is the funny part. These restrictions only applied in Rome itself. In other cities of the empire, they built as they pleased. The geographer Strabo wrote with surprise that in the Phoenician city of Tyre, the insulae were almost as impressive in height as in the capital. And in Carthage, before the Roman conquest, they built houses with 6 stories. And do you know what is most amazing? Some of these ancient skyscrapers have survived to this day. Right in the center of Rome, at the foot of the Capitoline Hill, still stands the Insula dell'Ara Coeli, a 5-story building about 30 meters high. 30 meters, built nearly 2,000 years ago. And in the 4th century of our era, Rome had the legendary Insula Felicles, located near the Circus Flaminius. 8 stories. It was so impressive that it became a real tourist attraction. It was shown to visitors along with the Column of Marcus Aurelius and the Pantheon. There were even more ambitious projects. The Septizodium, a monumental building constructed by Emperor Septimius Severus, according to some estimates, reached a height of 70 meters. True, it was not strictly a residential insula, but rather a ceremonial structure. But the scale is impressive. And now let us look at this in historical perspective. The first modern skyscraper was built in Chicago in the 1884th year. Its height was 42 meters. The Romans built buildings higher than this 2,000 years before the invention of steel, reinforced concrete, and elevators. Just think about that. Of course, life in such an insula was far from comfortable. Shops and workshops were usually located on the first floor. The second floor, sometimes the third, housed more or less decent apartments with several rooms. And further up, the worse it got. The upper floors were tiny cubbyholes, reached by narrow, steep stairs. No plumbing upstairs. Water had to be hauled up in buckets. Heating was a portable brazier, always the danger of fire. Unbearable heat under the roof in summer, cold and dampness in winter. The wealthy occupied the lower floors, or lived in separate villas altogether. The poor huddled upstairs. The higher a person lived, the lower their social status, literally. But the insulae solved the main problem. They allowed accommodating a huge number of people in a limited territory. According to official statistics, at the beginning of the 4th century of our era, Rome had only 1,790 private mansions and 46,602 insulae. 46,000. This was a city of apartment buildings, not villas. If you want to see what this looked like, go to Ostia. This ancient port city, which once served as the harbor of Rome, has preserved a huge number of insulae. They stand there to this day with empty window sockets, but still impressive. Ostia gives us an idea of population density comparable to modern megacities. In Pompeii, insulae had only begun to appear when Vesuvius buried the city under ash. The insula Aripolionis has been preserved there, an entire block with housing of different price categories. Researchers believe that if it were not for the eruption, Pompeii would gradually have been rebuilt in the style of Ostia. Multi-story insulae would have replaced the traditional houses with atriums. So, the real Rome was completely unlike the spacious city with villas shown in films. It was a noisy, cramped, vertical metropolis. Narrow streets between tall houses where sunlight rarely reached. Shops on the first floors, from which the cries of merchants echoed. Endless stairs leading to the upper floors. The smell of cooking food, workshops, unwashed bodies. The squeak of carts, the voices of people, the crying of children. All this echoed off the walls of the high insulae. The Romans created the first truly vertical cities in history. They solved the problem of overcrowding 1,500 years before London and New York had to do it. And yes, their high-rises were dangerous, cramped, and often collapsed and burned. But they worked. They allowed 1 million people to live in one city, which was an incredible achievement for the ancient world. So, the next time you see a modern high-rise, remember the Roman insulae. We have not strayed that far from our ancestors. They also faced a lack of space, rising land prices, and the need to fit as many people as possible into a limited area. And they found a solution we still use today, building up. Myth 9. Caligula appointed his horse consul. We talked about Nero and how legend distorted reality. But Nero was not the only Roman emperor whom history turned into a madman. There is another ruler whose name has become synonymous with madness and tyranny, Caligula. And the most famous story about him is, of course, the story about the horse. You have probably heard it 100 times. Emperor Caligula went so mad that he appointed his beloved racehorse Incitatus as a senator, or perhaps even a consul. The horse sat in the Senate, received a state salary, drank wine from golden cups at official receptions. Absolute, unsurpassed madness. A symbol of how far a tyrant who has lost his mind can go. This story is told in textbooks, mentioned in encyclopedias, and retold as an anecdote. It has become part of mass culture, a metaphor for an absurd appointment. When they want to say that a completely unsuitable person has been placed in an important position, they sometimes recall Caligula's horse. However, there is one small problem. It never happened. Let us figure out where this legend came from in the first place. As in the case of Nero, the source was ancient authors who wrote after the emperor's death. And they wrote, to put it mildly, not out of love for their subject. Suetonius Tranquillus, the same biographer who accused Nero of setting Rome on fire, left us a colorful description in his book, The Lives of the 12 Caesars. Caligula, he writes, so protected his horse Incitatus from disturbance that before races, he would send soldiers to enforce silence throughout the vicinity. A marble stable was built for the horse with ivory manger. He was given purple blankets and pearl necklaces. An entire palace with servants was allotted, where guests were invited on behalf of the horse. And here is the finale. They say he even intended to make him consul. Did you notice the key words? They say. Intended, not did, but intended. Another ancient historian, Cassius Dio, tells a similar story. Caligula invited Incitatus to dinner, treated him to golden barley grains, and drank to his health from golden cups. He swore by the horse's life and fate. And attention, he even promised to appoint him consul. And he surely would have done it if he had lived longer. Again, promised. Would have done. Not done, but could have done. Do you see the difference? Modern historians have spent much time analyzing these sources, and they came to interesting conclusions. Firstly, Suetonius and Cassius Dio apparently relied on the same earlier text that has not reached us. That is, these are not two independent testimonies, but essentially one. Secondly, both authors wrote decades after Caligula's death, relying on rumors and gossip. And gossip is a treacherous thing, especially when it comes to an unpopular emperor. And Caligula was very unpopular among the Roman elite. Young, self-confident, despising the old traditions and senatorial dignity. He ruled for only 4 years, from the 37th to the 41st year of our era. But during that time, he managed to make many enemies among the aristocracy. And then he was killed as a result of a conspiracy. And those who hated him during his life had the opportunity to write anything about him after death. So, what was actually going on with Incitatus? Caligula really loved his horse very much. He was a magnificent light gray stallion, the winner of many races. Initially, his name was Procelius. Piglet, a funny name for such a beauty. Caligula renamed him Incitatus, which means swift-footed. And yes, the emperor did pamper the horse. A luxurious stable, expensive harness, servants who watched his every move. All this is probably true. The Romans generally loved good horses, and Caligula was a passionate lover of racing. But as for the consulship, this is where the most interesting part begins. Most modern historians agree that it was either a joke or biting sarcasm. Caligula had, to put it mildly, complicated relations with the Senate. He considered the senators incompetent, greedy, and hypocritical, and he loved to provoke them. Imagine the scene, the emperor at some reception surrounded by pompous senators who consider themselves the salt of the earth. And Caligula, looking them in the eye, casually throws out, "You know what? My horse Incitatus would handle consular duties no worse than any of you." This is not an announcement of intention. It is mockery. It is a way to show how little the emperor thinks of the Senate's dignity. Moreover, one modern researcher named David Woods proposed a brilliant theory. He believes that the whole story with Incitatus is a play on words taken out of context. The Romans loved puns, especially those related to names. Equus Incitatus, swift-footed horse. Now look at the names of some of Caligula's contemporaries. The future emperor Claudius, his name comes from the word Claudus, which means lame. The joke constructs itself. Instead of a lame consul comes a swift-footed one, or Consul Servius Asinius Silere. His family name Asinius comes from the word asinus, donkey, and the cognomen Calere means swift. The result is swift donkey, and Caligula suggests replacing him with a swift-footed horse. Witty, right? But somewhere in the retellings, in the records of hostile historians, this joke turned into an accusation of madness. Irony and sarcasm were taken at face value. And then, over the centuries, the story became embellished with details. The horse did not just could become consul, he did become one. He sat in the Senate. He received a salary. Do you understand the mechanism? A hostile source, the desire to demonize an unwanted ruler, a lack of understanding of the context, and now a legend is born that will survive the centuries. Of course, this does not mean that Caligula was an exemplary ruler. He was indeed cruel, capricious, perhaps mentally unstable. But there is a huge difference between a capricious tyrant and a madman appointing a horse to state offices. Caligula used provocations to demonstrate his absolute power. He wanted to show that he could do anything, and no one could dictate terms to him. And the threat to make a horse consul was exactly such a provocation, political satire, mockery of the elite, and not a sign of insanity. This myth has lived for nearly 2,000 years and has become a symbol of tyrannical madness. It has entered textbooks, encyclopedias, and mass culture. But if you dig deeper, if you carefully read the very ancient sources that gave rise to it, it becomes clear. The story about the horse consul is another example of how hostile propaganda turns into historical truth. So, the next time you hear about the mad Caligula and his horse senator, remember, there is a huge chasm between intended and did. And this chasm is filled with prejudices, speculation, and the desire to turn an unpleasant ruler into a real monster. Myth 10. The Romans sowed Carthage with salt. We have debunked 9 myths about the Roman Empire. But there is one more story, perhaps the most symbolic of all. A story about Roman cruelty raised to the absolute. A story about how the victors wanted not just to destroy the enemy, but to erase the very memory of it from the face of the earth. Carthage, Rome's greatest rival, a city-state that dominated the Mediterranean for hundreds of years. A Phoenician colony that became an empire. 3 Punic Wars, 3 titanic clashes between 2 civilizations for the right to determine the fate of the West. And then, in the spring of the 146th year before our era, it all ended. After a 3-year siege, Roman legions broke into the city. Street fighting continued for 6 days. 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery. The city was burned and destroyed. But that, the legend goes, was not enough for the Romans. They salted the earth of Carthage, tons of salt, so that nothing would ever grow on that cursed land. So that even nature would forget that a great city once stood there, the ultimate symbol of hatred and revenge. The story is impressive, cruel, memorable. It has become part of mass culture, a metaphor for total destruction. To sow with salt means to destroy without hope of restoration. In Tunisia, where Carthage once stood, scattering salt is still considered a very bad omen. They say this superstitious fear comes from that distant tragedy. However, there is one small problem with this beautiful story. The Romans never did it. Let us go in order. Carthage was indeed Rome's main enemy for more than a century. The famous phrase of Cato the Elder, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, which he pronounced at the end of every speech in the Senate, no matter the topic. This obsession with destroying the rival. The Third Punic War was, in essence, not a war, but an execution. By that time, Carthage no longer posed a military threat. It was weakened, disarmed by the terms of previous treaties, subject to Rome. But it remained a rich trading center. And Rome decided that even this was too much. The Romans invented a pretext, a conflict between Carthage and the Numidian king Massinissa, an ally of Rome. The Carthaginians agreed to any terms, just to avoid war. They handed over 300 hostages. They surrendered all weapons, tens of thousands of armor sets, thousands of throwing machines. And only after this did the Romans announce their main demand, to leave the city and found a new settlement no closer than 10 miles from the sea. That is, practically to abandon trade, the very thing that made Carthage Carthage. It was then that the Carthaginians realized they had nothing to lose. The unarmed people forged new weapons in a month, melting down everything in the city for metal, statues, decorations. Even women gave their hair for bowstrings for the throwing machines. And they defended their doomed city for 3 years. When Scipio Africanus the Younger, the grandson of the Scipio who defeated Hannibal, finally captured Carthage, ancient authors describe him weeping as he looked at the burning city. Perhaps he understood the symbolic significance of the moment. Rome's greatest rival was passing into oblivion. But about the salt? Not a word. Let us look at the ancient sources. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century before our era, describes in detail the destruction of the city and the fate of its inhabitants. Nothing about salt. Poets Horace and Propertius mention the symbolic plowing of the land of Carthage with a plow, an ancient ritual of cursing when the site of a city was turned into arable land. But again, no salt. Polybius, and he is the most reliable source because he was a friend and companion of Scipio during the African campaign. He was there, saw everything with his own eyes, describes the ruins of Carthage, but even he, with all the detail of his narrative, says nothing about salting the earth. Appian of Alexandria reports an important detail. When Emperor Octavian Augustus decided to rebuild Carthage at the end of the 1st century before our era, that is, a century after the destruction, the new city was built a short distance from the old site. It was said that this was done to avoid ancient curses, but if the earth had truly been salted, it would have been mentioned as the main obstacle to restoration. Yet there is silence about it. So where did the legend come from? It appeared surprisingly late, only in the historiography of the 19th century. European historians studying the ancient Near Eastern practices of the Assyrians and Hittites found mentions of the ritual salting of conquered cities. This was a form of magical curse. Salt symbolized barrenness and desolation, and someone decided that the Romans must have used the same practice against their greatest enemy. It seemed logical, symbolic, dramatic. The story stuck and began to travel from book to book, acquiring details. By the 20th century, the myth had turned into common knowledge. But here is the irony of fate. Immediately after the war, the territory around Carthage was declared Ager Publicus, public land of the Roman people. And this land immediately became one of the most important sources of grain for Rome. The fertile fields of North Africa fed the Eternal City for decades. Pliny the Elder, our old acquaintance, the encyclopedist of the 1st century, mentions that the Romans sometimes did use salt in agriculture. But for what purpose? To scare animals away from certain pastures. Small amounts of salt scattered over the ground caused livestock to bypass those areas. A practical, economic application. No ritual curses. And think about it purely practically. To truly make a large territory unsuitable for farming, tons and tons of salt would have been needed. In antiquity, salt was an expensive commodity. Roman soldiers received part of their salary in salt, hence the word salarium, our salary. Spending such a quantity of valuable resources on a symbolic gesture? That is completely out of character for the pragmatic Romans. They wanted to destroy Carthage as a political and military force. Yes. They burned the city, destroyed the walls, sold the inhabitants into slavery. Yes. The famous library of Carthage burned, and we forever lost the Punic Chronicles, their version of events. It was a real tragedy, real barbarism. But they did not touch the land. The land was too valuable. The Roman Empire relied on bread. Panis et circenses, bread and circuses, remember? The Carthaginian fields began feeding the conquerors the very next year after the city fell. So this myth about salting the earth tells us more about the 19th century than about ancient Rome, about the romanticization of ancient cruelty, about the desire to make history more dramatic than it actually was. Real history is always more complicated than legend. The Romans were cruel conquerors. There is no doubt about that. They destroyed a great city and civilization, erased from the map a power that had been their equal for centuries. But they did this not for the sake of a mystical curse, but for entirely earthly goals: power, territory, wealth. And they used the fertile lands of the vanquished enemy with maximum efficiency. Carthage was destroyed, but its land continued to live and feed people. The salt remained where it belonged, in the sea that washed the shores of ancient Africa. Conclusion. And so we have completed this journey together. 10 myths, 10 stories about how legend defeated truth. And you know what I think now? How readily we are willing to believe in beautiful fictions instead of complicated reality. Vomitoria turned into vomiting rooms, although they were just passages in an amphitheater. Gladiators became ideally muscular heroes, although they actually had a layer of fat for protection. Legionaries dressed in bright red, although they wore tunics of all colors of the rainbow. Nero played a non-existent violin. Caligula appointed a horse consul, although he only joked about it, and Carthage was salted with salt that was never there. Where did all this come from? The answer, as usual, is multi-layered. Part of the myths was born from hostile propaganda. Ancient authors wrote about unwanted emperors with outright hatred, turning their quirks into signs of madness. Senators took revenge on rulers on the pages of history for the humiliations they endured during their lives. Other myths arose from incorrect interpretations. Historians of the 19th century, finding mention of some ancient rituals among the Assyrians or Hittites, decided that the Romans must have done the same. Latin words were taken literally, without considering metaphors and context. And then, these interpretations traveled from book to book, gathering details. And finally, Hollywood played a huge role. Cinema, with its love for spectacle and drama, created the image of Rome that we carry in our minds. Bright colors, sharp contrasts, simple stories of heroes and villains. It is beautiful, it sells, it sticks in the memory. But it has a very distant relation to reality. And the real Roman Empire was much more complex and interesting than any movie. It was a civilization that existed for more than 1,000 years and went through an incredible journey from a village on a hill to the center of the world. The Romans were amazingly practical people. They created a developed legal system that still influences the legislation of half the planet. They built roads, aqueducts, amphitheaters, insulae skyscrapers, engineering marvels, many of which still function today. Their society was complexly structured. Yes, they were patriarchal, but women had more rights than we think. Yes, they owned slaves, but their economy was surprisingly diverse. Yes, they were cruel conquerors, but they also knew how to learn from conquered peoples and absorb the best of their cultures. And here is what is important to understand. When we simplify history into a set of bright myths, we lose all the most interesting parts. We lose the understanding of how ancient societies actually worked, what motivated people, what problems they solved. History turns into a collection of anecdotes instead of a textbook of life. Therefore, and this is the main thing I want to say at the end of this long conversation, be critical of what you are told. Do not believe beautiful stories at face value. Look for primary sources. Read what the ancient authors themselves wrote, not retellings in popular articles. Look at what archaeologists find in the ground. Gladiator bones, business tablets of merchants, ruins of insulae. Material evidence does not lie. And remember, Rome did not disappear without a trace. We still live in the world they created. When we go to a stadium through vomitoria, a Roman invention. When we study jurisprudence based on Roman law. When we look at high-rise buildings in big cities, we are repeating what the Romans did 2,000 years ago. Even many of our words come from Latin. The Roman Empire fell, but its legacy lives on. And to understand this legacy, we need to know the real Rome. Not the Hollywood one, not the mythologized one, but the real, complex, contradictory one. That is the Rome worth studying. Thank you for being with me on this journey through myths and truth. I hope that now, when you hear another common knowledge story about ancient Rome, you will ask yourself, was it really so?